I'm going to test every single popular tactile switch to see which one's best for gaming, productivity, and just overall the best switch. I spent about $200 with each of these switches and quite a lot of time with each switch to help you decide exactly which switch is best for you. I'm going to test to see how each switch feels and give you a sound test for each to help you make the best decision possible. The most common tactile switch you're going to find in most pre-built keyboards is the Brown switch. Gateron, Cherry, and Kailh, those are the 3 companies you will most likely find in pre-built keyboards for Brown switches. I'm going to be testing the Gateron ones because to me they're the best quality and the ones that I tend to find most often. It has a pretty light actuation force of 42 GF, which is pretty light and one of the lightest that we're going to be testing today. The tactile bump is pretty light and you don't really feel it as much as most other tactile switches. To me, I really like the tactile bump, so it's not my favorite feeling switch, although it's pretty good for gaming because, like I said, it is a really light switch. I'd say the pros for the Gateron Browns are that they're very cheap and accessible, and they come in pretty much every single keyboard. Also, they're pretty decent overall for gaming. The cons are they aren't very tactile and the best feeling, and they're a really light switch, which isn't my personal preference. It might be a pro for some of you, but for me, it is a con. For gaming, I'll give it an 8.3 because it's really light and has a pretty good response time. For typing, I'll give it a 6.7. For the feel, I'll give it a 6.8. It doesn't really have that big of a tactile bump, so it's not my favorite. And then for the sound, it's not the best, so I'll give it a 6.6 out of 10. Next, we have the Boba U4T 65 gram. It's a pretty heavy tactile switch at 65 grams, of course, it's in the name. You feel the tactile point pretty early on at about 0.5 millimeters, and comparing that to the Gateron Browns, which was at around 1.7 millimeters. To me, it feels really nice overall, and it looked pretty nice. You have a nice opaque housing instead of a clear housing, so the RGB doesn't shine through it quite as well, but it does have a hole for the RGB, so it should shine through pretty decent, although not as good as a clear housing. For pros, I really like the feel of the Boba U4T. It has a nice big tactile bump, but that could also be a con as the tactile bump makes it pretty hard for gaming as it's a little bit too heavy. For gaming, I'm going to give it a 7.5 because it is pretty heavy to use for gaming, but everything else it's really good for. For typing, I'll give it an 8.3 because of the heavy tactile bump. It's meant a lot more for typing than gaming. For feel, for the same reason, I'll give it an 8.4 because of the nice tactile bump. And then for sound, it's not the greatest sound, so I'll give it a 7.9 as I don't really like the sound as much as some of the other switches on this list. The Gateron Zealios V2 is probably one of the most high-end switches on this list, and it's high-end for a reason. It's really good overall. It has a nice clear housing, so the RGB shines through quite nicely on it. It has an actuation force of 48 GF, while the operating force is around 69 GF. The Zealios V2 just feel really good to type on. They're really smooth switches, but for the cons, I'd say that they're just really expensive and they're not the best for gaming. My switches are lubed and I don't have any that aren't lubed, so might be a little bit more biased, and unlubed it might get a little bit worse scores. But for gaming, I'll give it a 7.2 because even lubed it is quite heavy to game with. For typing, I'll give it a 9.2 though because lubed it is very, very smooth, and even when they weren't lubed, I remember them being very smooth as well. For feel, these are one of the best feeling switches you'll ever touch in your life. They're a 9.4 for me because they just feel insane. And for sound, I'll give them a 9.1 T1. They're quite insane sounding. It just sounds really smooth. You can barely hear it. It almost sounds like a linear switch. The Durock Sunflower T1 is a really nice switch. It's got an opaque housing like the Boba U4T, and it has an actuation force of 46 GF, which is not too heavy and also not too light, but it's pretty easy to press. Pros, I'd say the tactile bump is really nice and it's really big. For cons, the pre-travel distance is a little bit too big at 2.6 millimeters, which makes it pretty hard to use for gaming. Also, the sound is not the greatest. It just doesn't sound the best. For gaming, like the Zealios, I'll give it a 7.1 because of the big heavy tactile bump. For typing, I'll give it an 8.7. For feel, I'll give it an 8.8. And then for sound, I don't really like it too much, so I'll give it a 6.8. The Durock T1 has a smoky black housing to it, an actuation force of 46 GF. It's got a pretty big pre-travel distance of 2.4 millimeters, which makes it a little bit harder to press down. The pros for the Durock T1 is it just feels really nice to press and the sound isn't too bad. For me, the cons is if you look at the latency on ratings.com, it's not the best as they have tested pretty much every switch and the latency is pretty bad on it. So the switch for gaming in theory isn't great. Although when I've been testing it, it wasn't too bad. I didn't really notice it, but that's something to look out for if you're really competitive in gaming. For gaming, I'd give it an 8.1 overall. For typing, I'd give it an 8.7. For feel, I'd give it an 8.8, and for the sound, I'd give it a 7.7. It just has a really nice tactile bump, just the sound's not the greatest. You just gotta lube it a little bit and I feel like it would sound a lot better. The Akko V3 Cream Blue Pro is a nice blue switch. It's got a blue clear housing to it and an actuation force of a light 39 GF. The pros for the Akko Cream Blues are it's really nice for gaming. It's pretty quick, a really light switch. For the cons, I say it doesn't sound the best out of all the switches. If you're looking for like some nice stocky switches, it's not this one. It's got more of a higher ping to it compared to the other switches. So for gaming, I give it an 8.9 overall. For typing, I give it an 8.2. For feel, I'd give it an 8.1. And for sound, I'd give it a 7.3. The Kailh Speed Copper is pretty much meant for gaming because of its name. You can tell it's the speed. So it does have a very light actuation force of 42 GF. Not the lightest, but it's pretty light. But the pre-travel distance is only 1.1 millimeters. So you barely have to press it down in order to actuate the key. It does only have 3 pins, so it might be a little bit loose compared to the 5-pin switches, although it shouldn't be too much of a factor. The speed coppers are some of the fastest pressing switches, so they're really good for gaming, but sounding wise, it sounds really scratchy overall, and just typing, it doesn't feel as good as the other switches. For gaming, I'd give it an 8.7 overall. For feel, I'd give it a 6.9 overall. For sound, I'd give it a 6.9 as well. And for typing, I'd give it a 7.2 overall. The Drop Holy Panda is one of the most popular tactile switches. It's got an opaque white housing and an actuation force of 46 GF. The Holy Pandas are some of the nicest feeling switches, but they're not great for gaming, and also they're quite expensive and you have to buy them on drop.com only. For gaming, I'd give it an 8.3 overall. It's pretty good, although the latency is not the greatest and it's pretty heavy to press, but it feels really nice to game on. For typing, I'd give it an 8.8, and for feel, I'd give it an 8.4. I feel like this switch could really benefit from a little bit of lube. For sound, I'd give it a 7.4. It's not the greatest sounding switch. Next, we have the Neapolitan Ice Cream switch. This is the best looking switch if you're just gonna run no keycaps, which I don't think anybody does, but it has a nice pink housing and a nice little copper brown stem to it. The actuation force is 42 GF. The Neapolitan Ice Cream switches are just really good at everything. They're pretty good for gaming, and they feel really good for typing, and the sound isn't too bad. It's actually one of my favorite sounding switches on this list. If I were to find a con, they're not quite the smoothest switch out of the box if you don't lube them, as well as the housing is opaque, so if you do want RGB, it won't shine through. I mean, I just put that as a con here. There is some other switches on this list that have opaque housings as well and not clear ones. For gaming, I'd give it an 8.5 overall. For typing, I'd give it an 8.8. For feel, I'd give it an 8.8 as well. And then for sound, I'd give it an 8.1. These are the final overall scores I feel are the best after using all of these switches. I feel like the Zealios V2 are by far the best switches even when they're not lubed, though they aren't the best if you want to use them mostly just for gaming. If you do use the switches mostly for gaming, I would go with the Kailh Speed Coppers or the Akko Cream Blue Pros. I really like the Akko Cream Blue Pros. On paper, however, the Speed Coppers are a little bit better for gaming. And if you want a switch that's just good at everything, the Neapolitan Ice Cream switches are pretty much good at everything. There's really no fault to them. They're not insane at anything like the Zealios V2 that are insane feeling and just good overall for typing, and they're not really bad at anything either. I'd say they're really good at everything. Now, you probably want a good keyboard to put these switches in next, so you might want to check out this video right here, and you might want to consider subscribing, as I'm going to be posting the video for the best keyboards for 2024 in my next video.